Hey guys, so let's get right into this. This will be Chapter 21, Video 1B, where we're going to cover the second half of Section 1. And we'll start talking about new transportation and communication. All right, so we discussed in Chapter 19 how the steam engine led to the development of the locomotives and railroads. And during the later industrial period, railroads expanded significantly. The United States saw railroads run all the way from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And Russia created the Trans-Siberian Railroad, where it started here in Moscow, right, the capital of the Russian Empire, and made its way all just south of the Siberian plain to the Pacific Ocean. So thousands and thousands of miles would not have been possible without kind of some major improvements in steel production in Russia. Now, local travel also changed with the invention of the automobile. Now, the automobile started in Europe. A German inventor, Nicholas Otto, he created the first gas-powered internal combustion engine. Now, making a small vehicle with steam engine wasn't very practical, since steam engines require large amounts of wood or coal to burn. So just constantly shoving coal into a car for 2 or 3 people, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But gasoline engines, that changes things now. So gasoline engines make it possible to build smaller vehicles for local travel. In 1886, another German guy, Carl Benz, and you guys probably recognize the name, you still see it in the luxury car brand Mercedes-Benz, he received the first patent for an automobile, and it was called the horseless carriage. And you can see why. This was a car, believe it or not. Let me just erase this. It was only 3 wheels. It didn't even have a steering wheel. It just had kind of a handle that turned the front wheel. But still, this back here, that's an engine. And if it's using an internal combustion engine to propel you forward, technically that made it an automobile. So very, very different from our modern day fancy automobiles, but this is the grandfather of them all. All right, this is what got it started. But a lot of people laughed at this. They said this will never replace horses. They thought it was dangerous. They thought it would just explode and so forth. But it quickly revolutionized transportation. People soon recognized that using this can take you faster and farther than a horse, or certainly on foot. So even though it started in Europe, though, production really took off in America with Henry Ford and the Model T. And Model T is really kind of like that iconic early American car. And you notice how it's being produced with the assembly line. Ford used the assembly line to make cars, to mass produce them. And when you mass produce them, like we talked about at the end of this video, you make them cheaper. So this makes them more available to people besides the very, very wealthy. Now, by the early 1900s, cars were quickly becoming the standard form of travel, and certainly by the 1930s and 40s, they had completely made carriages obsolete. The internal combustion engine wasn't only for automobiles. It was also used in the air with airplanes. And this was made possible because in 1903 of the Wright brothers, right, the famous first flight they took in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the beach there. Now you look at it, this flight only lasted a couple seconds, and they're barely off the ground, but it's still technically a flight. They were using an engine to make a sustained flight. They were not gliding on winds or anything like this. And this was a big game changer, obviously. It ushered in a new age of humans taking over the sky. Obviously, very, very different from our F-15 fighter jets and things like that. But the same way that horseless carriage led to Bentleys and Maseratis and Lamborghinis, this thing started all for airplanes as well. All right, now communication. Some would argue that these developments have had the farthest effect in the modern era in making the world a smaller place. In 1884, an American, Samuel Morse, developed a telegraph. Now, this device could send messages in code over wires. What you do is you would tap down on this part, and a wire would run in between this little gap right there. And, you'd send it in pulses, D type of thing. And this code was named Morse code in honor of the guy Samuel Morse who invented it. Now, this was revolutionary at the time, but it took a long time to type out messages, and it relied on physical wires. If you cut the wires, you couldn't send the message. An even faster form of communication came about, though, in 1876, when Scottish-born but American an American resident inventor named Alexander Graham Bell, hopefully you guys have heard of him, invented the telephone. Now, rather than send out a message in code, a person could speak directly to another person miles away. Still over physical wires, but the ability to transport your voice across these wires was a huge improvement from the code that you had to send with the telegraph. Wireless technology started to come about in the early 20th century, though. That started in 1901 with an Italian inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, when he invented the radio. After Marconi, sending signals and eventually voices without wires was possible. Now, all of these are predecessors of our modern-day cell phones and wireless internet. These are kind of, as I said, the ancestors of our cell phones, of our streaming technology, of our wireless routers, and so forth. Now, industrialization didn't just result in new forms of technology. It also resulted in new forms of business. And we often refer to these kinds of business as big business. Okay, you think of it as these super wealthy corporations, these big conglomerates, right, that are kind of standard today. Those were not very common before industrialization, of the kind of the image of the fat cat of these super wealthy media conglomerates and so forth, these industrial tycoons that control everything. That started to become more and more common in this later industrial period. They owned all the steps of production. All right, they owned everything from the money to the manufacturing, even to the distributing of goods. So all methods of it were owned by the big business here, right on the dude's belly. Think about how this is different from the putting out system. The putting out system, things were kind of broken up into pieces. The merchant would kind of have to buy the materials from somebody else. The merchant would then have to have somebody else do the production for him, the manufacturing, and then he would handle the transportation, so forth. Big business handles everything themselves, right? So even though they got to pay for it, all the profits are coming in as well. This came about mostly from the selling of stocks. Now, stocks are shares of company, right? Here's a picture of a board on a modern-day stock exchange. All of these letters right here, they represent abbreviations of different companies and the value of their stock, whether it's going up or down or so forth. Right? This is an example of an old share of something, right? It's a phony one, ABCD Corporation. But they're also referred to as shares because you were literally buying a share of a company. Right? They're bought by investors and sold by the company itself in order to raise money for investment so a company can grow. However, once a company starts selling shares of stock, it is no longer owned by a single person. But it does allow for a tremendous amount of growth. And so now smaller single-owned businesses can expand to become corporations. And this is what happened. When a company needs a lot of money, it can sell thousands of shares and in turn potentially raise millions of dollars. And this turns itself into a corporation. Corporations are owned by many investors who buy shares of stocks. Large corporations eventually could expand to become monopolies and cartels. Now, monopolies and cartels, they're somewhat similar. Both cut off competition and allow companies to raise prices. The rise of big business, it sparked a debate about whether this stuff was really good. You had the view that some of these guys were positive for it, but you also had the view, I'll just move this down, that these were hurtful, to the consumers. You look at this one of this monster that's all over the industrial area, and you notice what's written on it right here, monopoly, and that they were kind of strangling out the workers and that they were crushing everything in their path. It was kind of the competing image that you had of these men who ran it as captains of industry who were to be respected and admired, and people should say, let's be like them, or robber barons. Right? A baron is a rich, powerful person. Robber is self-explanatory, that they are robbing from everybody, from the government, from the working class, from the poor, etc., and that they were hurting free trade and they were ruining people's lives. Regardless of the views that people had on it, there's no denying that industrialization led to huge changes in how businesses operate, and we still see this debate going on today. All right, so that wraps it up for section 1 of chapter 21, and then we will get into the next one to talk about some further developments in this later industrial period.